I want you to think about a time um, when you just poured your heart out to someone.
Yeah, like really opened up.
Exactly. I mean, maybe you were navigating this brutal situation at work or dealing with a complex family crisis.
Or just feeling completely lost.
Right. And the person sitting across from you, maybe a friend or your manager, they did everything mechanically right.
The textbook response.
Yeah, the appropriate eye contact, the right serious nods. They even said the exact words you learned in those active listening seminars, like, I hear you, or that sounds incredibly difficult.
Right, checking all the boxes.
But despite all those flawless mechanics, the interaction just felt utterly hollow. You walked away feeling honestly more isolated than if you had just talked to a brick wall.
Which is such an awful feeling.
It really is. And the question is, why does that happen? Why do the mechanics of empathy sometimes fail so spectacularly, even when someone is going through all the right motions?
It's an incredibly disorienting experience, right? Because it defies all our standard metrics for good communication. Well, you can't accuse the person of ignoring you because they were maintaining eye contact.
Right.
And you can't claim they were dismissive because their script was perfectly validating. But your nervous system, your body, detects this fundamental absence in the interaction.
Like something crucial is missing.
Exactly, because we've historically treated empathy as this innate, almost mystical personality trait, like a binary where you're either a natural empath or you're just completely detached.
Right, you either have it or you don't.
Yeah, but that paradigm totally fails to explain these hollow interactions. It doesn't explain why highly intelligent, well-meaning people routinely butcher these moments of crucial connection.
And that structural failure is exactly what we're unpacking in today's deep dive. We've got our hands on some truly fascinating source material.
Yes, it's a brilliant paper.
It's a revised August 2025 paper by Hisataka Takasugi. He's the director of the Takasugi Research Institute, or TRI, over in Tokyo.
Such groundbreaking work coming out of there right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this paper introduces a highly operationalized framework called Empathetic Intelligence, or Kaikanchise.
Right, Kaichisei.
And our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct why empathy isn't just this vague, warm feeling. It's actually a highly trainable, dual-component skill, deeply rooted in our biology, our cognitive psychology, and, our cross-cultural adaptability.
What Takasugi's work does is basically take empathy out of the realm of abstract poetry and put it under a clinical microscope.
I love that.
He's offering this granular, mechanical understanding of how human connection actually functions at a biological level. And more importantly, he gives us a highly specific diagnostic map for precisely where and how that connection breaks down.
So for anyone listening right now, whether you're managing a global corporate team spread across 4 time zones.
Which is a nightmare in itself.
Totally. Or maybe you're trying to navigate tricky family dynamics or just trying to be genuinely present for a friend. This framework offers a completely new lens. We're really looking under the hood of human connection today.
It's so relevant right now.
Let's start with the baseline problem Takasugi identifies. We live in this hyper-globalized, technologically mediated era. Right?
Oh, yeah. Slack, Zoom, endless text threads.
Exactly. We're trying to build trust over video calls with Tokyo, Slack messages with London, group chats with our families. But instead of unprecedented connection, we're actually seeing this massive spike in misinterpretation and trust breakdowns.
Yeah, the friction of our modern communication landscape is just unprecedented.
How does he define that friction?
Well, we're constantly crossing cultural, linguistic, and digital boundaries. And doing that strips away a massive amount of the contextual bandwidth that human beings actually evolved to rely on.
Like body language, microexpressions, all of that.
Exactly. And when organizations recognize this friction, their default response is usually to mandate some sort of training, like emotional intelligence, EQ, or social intelligence, SI.
Which we've all sat through, I'm sure.
Right. And Takasugi's paper acknowledges those models were vital stepping stones. But he argues they're fundamentally insufficient for our current landscape for 2 very specific reasons.
Okay, let's unpack those. I imagine the first reason has to do with just how vague those models can be in practice.
Completely.
Because telling a stressed out project manager to just be more emotionally aware doesn't actually give them a tool to use when a meeting is falling apart, right?
Exactly. EQ and SI lack operational specificity. They emphasize awareness, which is great, but they fail to provide clear, granular, teachable skills that you can systematically measure and practice in real time. especially under pressure.
You can't just be vaguely aware when you're getting yelled at in a boardroom.
Right. And the second gap is cultural adaptability, a behavioral expression of empathy that establishes trust in, say, a tech startup in Silicon Valley.
Like a highly direct emotive intervention. Let's talk about our feelings right now.
Exactly. That exact same behavior might be perceived as intrusive, unprofessional, or even destabilizing in a traditional corporate boardroom in Kyoto.
Right, because the norms are totally different.
Empathy simply cannot be treated as a universal, one-size-fits-all behavioral script.
Which brings us to Takasugi's new framework. He moves away from those older models and introduces Empathetic Intelligence, or EmpI, and he defines it as a dual-competence loop.
The dual-competence loop, yes! This is crucial.
So the first half of this loop is empathetic sensitivity, which you achieve through empathetic listening. The paper describes this as the ability to perceive nuanced emotional states, subtle intentions, and contextual clues without jumping to premature judgment.
And that requires a massive amount of cognitive discipline.
I bet.
Empathetic sensitivity is the disciplined reception of another person's reality. You are intentionally creating cognitive space by actively bracketing your own biases, your own assumptions, and this is the hard part, your own urgency to reply.
Oh, that's so hard. We all just want to fix things or give advice immediately.
Exactly. But here, you're merely gathering the raw data of their experience, the micro-expressions, the pacing of their speech, the tension in their posture.
But gathering data is only the first half of the process, right? Because if you just sit there silently analyzing someone while they cry, it's deeply unnerving.
Yeah, that's just creepy. You have to close the loop.
So what's the second half?
The second half of the loop is empathetic communication, which is executed through empathetic reflection.
Okay.
This is the intentional outward expression of your empathy in a format that is actually perceptible and meaningful to the recipient. The goal isn't just to understand them intellectually, it's to demonstrate that understanding in a way they can authentically feel and validate.
You know, when I was reviewing the source material, this constant back and forth between sensitivity and communication immediately reminded me of how a submarine navigates using active sonar.
Oh, that is a remarkably precise way to conceptualize the feedback loop. I like that.
Think about the mechanics of it. You send out a ping of attention, right? That's the empathetic listening. Then you sit in the dark and wait to see what bounces back. You're reading the return signal. You're noting the hesitation in their voice or a sudden shift in their eye contact.
Gathering the raw data.
Exactly. That return data builds your empathetic sensitivity. You are literally mapping the emotional waters around you. But you can't just sit there holding the map. You have to calibrate your next transmission based on that specific topography.
Right.
So that adjusted transmission is your empathetic reflection. You ping out, you read the return, and you adjust the next ping.
And what makes that sonar analogy so perfect is that Takasugi explicitly models these two competencies as mutually amplifying.
Meaning they feed into each other.
Exactly. Your sensitivity refines the accuracy of your communication, and when you communicate with high accuracy, the recipient's nervous system detects that they're being understood.
Which probably makes them drop their guard.
Yes, which causes them to open up further. That opening provides your sensitivity with even richer, more nuanced data on the next pass. The resolution of the sonar image gets continuously sharper with every loop.
Okay, I see the mechanics of it, and it makes sense. But I do want to push back on the novelty of this for a moment.
Go for it.
Because anyone who has studied basic psychology is going to hear this and immediately think of Carl Rogers.
Ah, yes. The grandfather of active listening.
Right. We're basically talking about the foundational elements of humanistic psychology from the 1950s. Rogers built his entire career on this concept of accurate empathy, active listening, unconditional positive regard, reflecting the client's feelings back to them.
He did.
So what is Takasugi actually bringing to the table in 2025 that we didn't already figure out 70 years ago?
It's a really critical distinction to make, and Takasugi actually honors Rogers as the architectural foundation of empathetic intelligence.
So he's building on it, not replacing it.
Precisely. Rogers articulated the absolute necessity of holding an as-if quality, understanding the other person as if you are them, but without ever losing the boundary of your own identity.
Right, maintaining that professional distance while still connected.
Yes. However, Takasugi is executing a massive leap in application here. Remember, Rogers designed his framework for the clinical environment.
Right, a therapist's office.
Exactly. He was operating in an office where the soul explicitly agreed upon goal of the interaction is the psychological well-being of the client.
Which is a completely artificially protected environment compared to, say, a chaotic corporate negotiation or a bitter family argument.
Completely. Takasugi is adapting these mechanisms for high-stakes, highly mediated, cross-cultural environments where multiple, often conflicting agendas are at play at the exact same time.
A CEO and a therapist have entirely different baseline objectives.
They do. But beyond just the environmental application, Takasugi introduces a concept that addresses the exact limitation of Rogers' work when it's applied to the general public. He calls it the ontological gap.
The ontological gap. Okay, so we're shifting from psychology into philosophy here.
We are, because standard emotional intelligence and basic behavioral interpretations of Carl Rogers entirely fail to account for the mode of being. Yes, the fundamental ontological stance from which the empathy is emitted in the first place.
Okay, break that down for me. What do you actually mean by the mode of being?
Let's use your submarine sonar analogy.
Okay.
A practitioner can execute the sonar ping flawlessly. They can bracket their bias, observe the microexpressions, map the emotional waters, and deliver a perfectly calibrated phrase of empathetic reflection.
They do everything right on paper.
Yes. But if the captain of that submarine has a hidden self-serving agenda, like if they're utilizing those mechanics solely to pacify an employee so they won't quit, or to manipulate a hostile negotiation, the recipient's nervous system will detect the incongruence. The entire system fails because the underlying intent corrupts the technique.
Wow. So the mechanics of the loop are totally irrelevant if the underlying intention is compromised.
Exactly. Takasugi argues that you can't simply train the behavior, you have to train the underlying state of reality the practitioner is inhabiting.
Which brings us to the metaphysical basement of this whole theory.
Right. This requires us to look at a framework developed at TRI called Metaphysical Psychology. They examine human experience through ontological modes, which essentially just means they study how we fundamentally orient ourselves to reality.
Okay, and Takasugi condenses this into two primary operating states, right? Want thinking and must thinking.
Yes. Want thinking and must thinking.
Let's really map these out, because understanding these two states seems to be the absolute linchpin of why empathy either succeeds or feels totally performative. Let's start with want thinking. What is it?
Want thinking, or yokishiko, is an open, preference-based orientation toward reality.
Preference-based.
Right. When you operate in this mode, you engage with the world exactly as it presents itself. You can tolerate uncertainty, ambiguity, disappointment.
So you're not forcing an outcome.
Exactly. You might want a difficult conversation with a colleague to resolve peacefully, but you're cognitively and emotionally open to the reality of whatever they are actually experiencing, even if it's messy or super inconvenient for you.
You're just holding space for the truth of the moment.
Yes. And Takasugi asserts that want thinking is the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for any genuine empathic connection.
Okay. And the opposing state is must thinking. Kishaku shiko.
Yes. Must thinking is a rigid, demand-based orientation.
So a demand, not a preference.
Exactly. In this state, your preferences have hardened into absolute requirements. You are no longer engaging with reality. You are imposing a preconceived schema onto it.
You're forcing the puzzle piece to fit, even if it's the wrong shape.
Right. The paper uses a really striking phrase here. It states that must thinking colonizes perception before empathic attention can even form.
Colonizes perception. That implies a hostile takeover how we even see the world. How does a demand actually alter our perception mechanically?
It comes down to predictive coding in the brain.
Okay.
When you are operating under a rigid demand, say, the demand that this performance review meeting must end in 5 minutes because you're behind schedule, your brain fundamentally alters its sensory gating.
It filters out what it doesn't want to see.
Precisely. It prioritizes information that confirms your demand and actively suppresses information that threatens it. You are no longer seeing the nuance of the other person. You're only measuring how their behavior aligns with your operational requirement.
I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the phenomenology of this. It sounds like the difference between reading a novel purely for the pleasure of the story versus speed reading a dense textbook at 2 in the morning because you have a final exam in a few hours.
Oh, that is a highly illustrative way to look at the cognitive states involved. How would you say the processing of information differs between those two scenarios?
Well, think about it. When you read a novel for pleasure, right, that's operating in want thinking.
Yeah.
You're just receiving the narrative. You let the characters develop organically, you accept the plot twists, and you're entirely open to the reality the author built. You aren't forcing this story to be anything other than what it is.
You're present with it.
Exactly. But when you're cramming that textbook in a panic at 2 a.m., that is pure must-thinking. You aren't absorbing the beauty of the prose or contemplating the deeper context. Your eyes are just aggressively scanning the page, hunting only for the bolded vocabulary words you need to survive the test.
Right.
You are actively imposing your desperate need to pass the exam onto the text. You're not actually reading, you're foraging for survival.
And the neurological consequence of that cramming state is profound. Because you're hunching for survival data, you literally shut down the neural networks responsible for broad integrative thinking.
Wow.
Now apply that to human interaction. If you are deploying active listening techniques merely because you must appear competent for a performance review, or you must calm your partner down so you can finally get some sleep.
You're testing for the bolded terms.
Exactly. You are entirely closed off to the organic narrative of their actual experience.
And the recipient can actually feel that difference, even if I say the exact right words.
Mm-hmm. They absolutely can. And Takasugi isolates this exact dynamic to prove it. He presents a scenario in the paper with two highly trained communication practitioners. Let's call them practitioner A and practitioner B.
Okay.
Both are dealing with an overwhelmed client. Both utilize the identical empathetic reflection phrase. It sounds like the scope of this new project is making you feel incredibly overwhelmed.
So the behavior is identical. The words are exactly the same.
Yes. The social mechanics are a perfect match. However, practitioner A is anchored in want thinking. They possess a genuine open curiosity about the client's internal state.
They're reading the novel.
Right. Practitioner B, on the other hand, is trapped in must thinking. They are driven by an internal demand to resolve the client's emotion quickly so they can secure a contract renewal.
They're cramming for the tests.
Yes. And Takasugi demonstrates that despite the identical phrasing, practitioner B's delivery will be experienced by the recipient as phenomenologically hollow.
That phrase, phenomenologically hollow, it cuts right to the core of the experience we talked about at the beginning of this deep dive. The words are correct, but the lived, felt reality of receiving those words is just completely empty.
Exactly. And Takasugi doesn't just theorize this, he operationalizes it through what he calls a recipient-based authenticity metric.
What does that mean?
Well, traditional EQ training often evaluates the practitioner, right? Like, did you use the correct active listening prompts?
Did you nod 3 times?
Right. But Takasugi evaluates the recipient. He asks them, did you feel genuinely comprehended? Did you perceive the practitioner as authentically invested in grasping your reality?
Because we can tell when we're being played.
Exactly. Human beings possess an incredibly sophisticated evolutionary radar for detecting instrumentalized empathy. That is, empathy deployed as a tool to manage or manipulate us rather than to actually connect with us.
The implication here is just staggering for corporate training. I mean, you can send a manager to a week-long seminar on active listening. They can memorize every behavioral framework perfectly.
Pass all the tests.
Right. But if their underlying ontological state remains locked in must-thinking, the training is functionally useless. The empathy will always read as hollow.
Always.
But here's where I really have to play the skeptic for a minute.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because it is incredibly easy for us to sit here in a studio calmly discussing philosophy and say, oh, just stay in want thinking. Just be open to reality.
It sounds lovely on paper.
Right. But when a real conversation detonates, when an employee is furious with you or a family member accuses you of something deeply unfair, we don't consciously choose to become rigid.
No, we don't.
We instantly panic. The shift into must-thinking feels entirely involuntary. I must defend my reputation. I must regain control of this room. If this is just a philosophical failing, it seems literally impossible to fix under pressure.
Your skepticism is precisely what bridges the gap to the most critical mechanism in Takasugi's research. You are completely correct that the shift feels involuntary, because it is involuntary.
Wait, it is.
Yes. Takasugi argues that dropping into must thinking is not a moral or philosophical failing. It is a biological hijack.
A biological hijack. Okay, so we're moving beneath the psychology now. We're going down into the hardware of the body itself.
Yes. We are entering what the TRI model refers to as layer 0.
Layer 0.
To explain this biological substrate, the paper integrates the foundational work of Dr. Stephen Porges, specifically his Polyvagal Theory.
I've heard of that, but remind me how it works.
Layer 0 is essentially the autonomic nervous system, which dictates our physiological baseline long before our conscious brain ever has the opportunity to process an interaction. And the mechanism governing this layer is called neuroception.
Okay, perception is how my conscious brain interprets the world. What makes neuroception different?
Neuroception is your nervous system's subconscious continuous surveillance system.
Like a background process.
Exactly. Every millisecond, far below your conscious awareness, your autonomic nervous system is scanning your environment. It's assessing the micro-expressions, the vocal prosody, the body language of the person across from you, constantly searching for cues of safety or threat.
And what happens when it finds them?
Based on the data gathered by that neuroceptive scan, your biology is forced into one of 3 primary autonomic states.
Okay, walk me through the physiology of these 3 states. Let's start with a good one.
The primary state, the state we strive for, is ventral vagal dominance.
Ventral vagal.
Right. The vagus nerve is this massive cranial nerve that wanders throughout the body, connecting the brainstem to the heart, lungs, and digestive tract.
It connects everything.
Pretty much. When the myelinated ventral branch of the vagus nerve is dominant, your heart rate variability is high, your breathing is regulated, and this is amazing, your middle ear structures literally shift to better process the frequency of the human voice.
Wait, your ears actually change shape to hear people better?
Yes. Physiologically, this is your social engagement system coming online.
So biologically, this is the state where connection is actually possible.
Yes. Ventral vagal dominance is the biological home of want thinking. When you're in this state, you feel safe. And because you feel biologically secure, your brain allows full metabolic access to the medial prefrontal cortex.
Which is the smart part of the brain.
Exactly. The region responsible for perspective taking, complex problem solving, and curiosity.
Okay, so what happens when the neuroceptive radar detects a threat? Say, someone raises their voice at me, or a coworker challenges my authority in front of my boss.
Your nervous system instantly shifts into the second state, sympathetic activation.
The classic fight or flight.
Exactly. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, just sounds the alarm. Adrenaline and cortisol flood your system. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing becomes shallow, and your pupils literally dilate to focus on the immediate physical danger.
And the third state. For when fighting or fleeing isn't an option, like if I'm trapped in a performance review, I can't leave.
That is dorsal vagal activation. This relies on the older, unmyelinated branch of the vagus nerve. If the threat is perceived as completely overwhelming and inescapable, your biology initiates a shutdown response.
Like a possum playing dead.
It is the physiological equivalent of playing dead. Your heart rate drops drastically, you dissociate, and you become completely emotionally numb.
Okay, so how does this autonomic shifting specifically dictate our capacity for empathetic intelligence?
But this is Takasugi's most disruptive thesis in the whole paper. If your nervous system is trapped in sympathetic activation or dorsal vagal shutdown, your empathic hardware is biologically offline.
Wait, I really want to clarify the absolute nature of that statement.
Please do.
Are you saying that if I'm highly stressed about a quarterly earnings report and I've had way too much caffeine and my sympathetic nervous system is actively engaged, I am not merely distracted, I am physiologically incapable of being genuinely empathetic to a colleague who walks into my office seeking support?
That is precisely what the neurocognitive data indicates.
That's terrifying.
It is, because empathetic sensitivity requires the complex functioning of the mentalizing network, which heavily relies on that medial prefrontal cortex we talked about.
The part that needs safety to operate.
Right. When your amygdala detects a threat and triggers sympathetic activation, it forcefully overrides the prefrontal cortex to conserve metabolic energy for immediate physical survival. The neural pathways required to hold an as-if perspective, to genuinely perceive and resonate with another person's emotional reality, are systematically starved of resources. You literally cannot process the data.
So when I'm in that stressed, high adrenaline state and I try to deploy active listening anyway, what am I actually doing?
You're simulating empathy.
Just thinking it.
Yes, you're accessing the pre-programmed behavioral scripts you memorized, the eye contact, the nodding, the validating phrases, but the actual receptive mechanism in your brain is broken. You are a radar dish trying to receive a signal while the power cord is literally unplugged.
Wow.
And Takasugi highlights a terrifying self-reinforcing loop here.
A feedback loop between the biology and the psychology.
Exactly. When you adopt a must-thinking orientation, for instance, an internal demand that I must control the outcome of this negotiation, that psychological rigidity is interpreted by your own body as a physical survival imperative.
So my body thinks, If I don't control this meeting, I will be eaten by a lion.
Yes, your biology assumes that if this demand is not met, you will die. This immediately triggers a sympathetic threat response. The ensuing flood of stress hormones further degrades your prefrontal cortex, which strips away your cognitive flexibility, locking you even deeper into the rigid, narrow focus of must thinking.
A complete downward spiral.
The psychology triggers the biology, and the biology reinforces the psychology. You spiral completely away from the physiological capacity for connection.
But wait, if the hardware is offline and we're caught in that biological spiral, how do we intervene? I mean, you can't just think your way out of a physiological threat response, right?
No, you absolutely cannot cognitive behaviorally rationalize your way out of a flooded amygdala. You can't just tell yourself to calm down.
Which is why telling an angry person to calm down never works.
Exactly. This is why Takasugi introduces an intervention called the Direct Access Protocol, or DAP.
The DAP, what is that?
The DAP is a rapid induction somatic and meditative protocol designed specifically to hack the nervous system.
How does the protocol actually function mechanically? What are you doing?
It utilizes specific respiratory pathways, often involving extended exhalations that leverage what's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia to manually stimulate the ventral vagus nerve.
So specific breathing techniques.
Right. By consciously manipulating the breath and your somatic focus, you send a bottom-up signal from the body back to the brainstem, communicating, hey, we are safe.
It's a manual override.
Yes. And TRI has validated this via EEG imaging. When a practitioner executes the DAP, you can literally observe the brainwave shift as the prefrontal cortex comes back online and downregulates the amygdala's threat response.
So it really functions as a manual physiological override, a biological reboot.
Exactly. And think about how this protocol entirely disrupts traditional corporate empathy training.
Oh, completely.
Most standard training manuals provide a conversational script and instruct you to deploy it immediately when a conflict arises. Takasugi argues that deploying a script while in sympathetic arousal guarantees hollow, performative empathy. The DIP demands that you biologically regulate your layer 0 baseline before you even attempt to engage the psychological or behavioral layers of the interaction.
Okay, so let's say we utilize the DAP. We take the breath, we manually stimulate the vagus nerve, we bring the prefrontal cortex back online, and we anchor ourselves in ventral vagal safety.
We're safe.
This physiological baseline allows us to transition from that rigid must thinking back into open, curious want thinking. We are finally ready to connect.
Yes, the system is primed.
But we still have to walk out into a chaotic world filled with people who operate on entirely different cultural, emotional, and linguistic operating systems.
That's the reality of it.
If we are completely open and receptive, how do we interact with intense, contradictory realities without our own psychological boundaries just totally collapsing?
That is a very real danger, and it's the exact tension Takasugi addresses through the concept of cognitive elasticity, or Ninchiteki Danryokuse.
Cognitive elasticity.
He defines it as the structural capacity of your psychological system to absorb massive perturbation, such as intense emotional distress from another person, deep cultural dissonance, or aggressive disconfirmation of your own beliefs without losing your configurational integrity.
Okay, that concept of absorbing perturbation while maintaining structural integrity, that immediately reminds me of the mechanics of shape memory alloys.
Ooh, interesting. Walk me through the mechanics of that analogy.
Have you ever seen those high-end flexible eyeglass frames made of titanium nickel-shaped memory alloys?
Oh, yeah, the ones you can bend all over the place.
Exactly. Their structural behavior is incredible. You can take those frames, twist the arms literally into a knot, and subject them to massive external stress. And they yield to the pressure. They deform to accommodate the force being applied to them.
Right.
But the absolute millisecond you release the pressure, the atomic structure of the alloy forces it to snap perfectly back to its original functional baseline. It never permanently deforms, but it also doesn't shatter under the strain.
That is an exceptionally precise mechanical metaphor for cognitive elasticity. I love that.
It maps on perfectly, right?
It does. When you attempt to empathize with someone experiencing a profound crisis, or you immerse yourself in an entirely foreign cultural paradigm, you are subjecting your own psychological system to immense external stress.
You're bending the glasses.
You are intentionally allowing your perspective to be bent out of shape by their reality. And Takasugi outlines two primary failure modes that occur when a practitioner lacks this shape memory elasticity.
Okay, what's the first failure mode? I'm assuming it's when the material is too brittle.
Precisely. The first failure mode is rigidity. This is the equivalent of cheap plastic glasses snapping under pressure.
They just break.
In psychological terms, rigidity occurs when the practitioner simply refuses to yield to the other person's reality. To protect their own psychological safety, they hide behind a wall of clinical technique. They remain completely unmoved and analytical.
Like a robot.
Right. The recipient is expressing profound grief, and the practitioner responds with a cold, emotionally barren reflection of their words. The practitioner remains safe, but the empathic connection is completely severed.
Okay, so that's rigidity. What is the secondary failure mode? What happens if it's too soft?
The second is merger, which is clinically known as affective contagion.
Affective contagion.
This happens when the practitioner yields to the external pressure, but possesses no shape memory to pull them back. They completely collapse into the other person's emotional state.
They drown in it.
Exactly. If the client is panicking, the practitioner begins to panic. They lose their observational baseline and just drown in the recipient's reality.
So cognitive elasticity is the balance between the two.
Cognitive elasticity represents the precise dynamic middle ground. You possess the structural flexibility to genuinely enter and be moved by their emotional world, but you retain the internal tension required to snap back to your own center of gravity.
How does this elasticity specifically apply to cross-cultural calibration? Because I noticed the paper heavily emphasizes the necessity of toggling between the emic and enic perspectives, which I know are concepts deeply rooted in anthropology.
The emic-enic toggle is arguably the most vital application of cognitive elasticity in our modern global landscape.
Define those terms for us.
Sure. To operate from an emic perspective means you are immersing yourself fully within the internal logic and specific norms of a given culture. You are attempting to understand their behavior from the inside out.
Like stepping into their shoes completely.
Right. Conversely, the emic-enic perspective is a universal, external meta-perspective. You pull back to observe the interaction objectively, comparing it against broader structural frameworks.
Can you give me a concrete scenario of how a failure to execute this toggle destroys an interaction? Let's ground this in a real-world example.
Absolutely. Consider an American project manager who has been highly trained in Western models of empathy.
Okay.
Now, Western models typically prioritize direct, explicit verbalization of emotions. They are accustomed to sitting a team member down and saying, I can see you frustrated, let's process those feelings together.
Very direct, let's hash it out.
Right. That approach is their native emic baseline. Now imagine this manager is transferred to lead a traditional division in Tokyo. In this specific cultural context, empathy is often communicated far more implicitly.
Right, reading the air.
Yes, reading the air. It prioritizes nonverbal accommodations and the active avoidance of direct emotional confrontation, which could cause a profound loss of face for the employee.
Oh boy. If the manager forcefully applies their direct verbal strategy in Tokyo, it will be catastrophic. The employee will likely feel exposed and humiliated, not understood.
Exactly. The manager's native empathy literally becomes a weapon.
That's awful.
But on the flip side, if the manager realizes this and completely abandons their own baseline, awkwardly attempting to mimic Japanese implicit communication without genuinely understanding the nuance they come in, they fall into the merger failure mode.
Because they're faking a cultural norm they don't actually get.
Right. They will appear profoundly inauthentic and confused, which completely erodes trust anyway.
So how does the shape memory alloy of cognitive elasticity actually resolve this impossible situation?
It allows the manager to tolerate the severe neurological discomfort of cultural dissonance.
The discomfort of being wrong.
Exactly. When the manager inevitably misreads a cultural cue because that failure creates a spike of uncertainty. Uncertainty usually triggers the amygdala, dropping the manager into a rigid must-thinking response, where they violently enforce their own cultural norms just to feel in control again.
We're doing it the American way because I'm the boss and I'm stressed?
Yes. But cognitive elasticity prevents that autonomic crash. It allows the manager to absorb the shock of being wrong, immerse themselves in the local cultural logic, the emic, to understand what the employee actually needs in that moment, and then smoothly pull back to their own AIC baseline to process the data and formulate a functional response.
It fundamentally re-engineers how we approach cross-cultural competency. I mean, it's no longer just a futile exercise in memorizing infinite lists of cultural taboos like don't plate your chopsticks or whatever.
Right, which never works anyway when the pressure is on.
It's fundamentally about training your nervous system to endure the intense friction of being an outsider without retreating into the biological panic of must-thinking.
That is the core of it.
But we must address the inevitable. No matter how elastic our cognitive shape memory is, there are moments when the stress exceeds the material limits.
Always. We're only human.
The alloy snaps. We drop violently into sympathetic arousal, we default to a rigid schema, and we entirely devastate a sensitive interaction. When that crash occurs, how do we diagnose it?
This is where Takasugi provides a highly specific diagnostic tool known as the RFC framework.
RFC, what does that stand for?
RFC stands for Reality, Foreclosure, Conflict. This framework maps the exact chronological and mechanical sequence of an empathy failure. It corresponds directly to the collapse of the dual-competence loop we established at the beginning of our discussion.
Let's trace the anatomy of the crash, step by step. Step 1, reality.
Step 1 involves reality distortion. This represents the total collapse of empathetic sensitivity.
The lengthening half of the loop.
Right. When a practitioner is locked in must-thinking, their predictive coding system aggressively overrides incoming sensory data. They systematically misperceive the reality of the person across from them by imposing a preconceived emotional schema.
Can we use an example here?
Sure. Consider an emergency room physician who is operating under immense time pressure and is just physically exhausted.
A very common scenario.
Yes. Now, a patient presents with symptoms that are deeply terrifying to them. But the physician must quickly categorize this patient to keep the ward moving. Driven by this biological demand, the physician's perceptual gating distorts the incoming data, deciding instantly that the patient is merely experiencing routine, mild anxiety.
So the physician's brain literally refuses to process the depth of the patient's terror because accommodating that complex reality threatens the physician's biological need for speed and control.
Exactly. The sensory input is corrupted at the source.
That leads us to step 2, foreclosure.
Foreclosure is the failure of the feedback loop itself. Even with a distorted initial perception, the patient will inevitably emit corrective signals.
Like what?
The patient might tense their shoulders, alter their vocal pitch, or explicitly state that their pain feels life-threatening. The data disconfirming the physician's schema is actively presented.
The patient is basically waving a red flag saying, you're wrong.
Yes. However, adjusting the mental model, accepting that this patient actually requires extensive, complex emotional engagement, would require a massive expenditure of metabolic and cognitive resources.
Resources the doctor doesn't have right now.
Right. So, to protect their own fragile biological baseline and preserve their self-image as a highly efficient professional, the physician's cognitive system aggressively forecloses. It slams the door on the disconfirming evidence, ignoring the cues entirely.
It's the submarine receiving a massive, anomalous reading on the active sonar, and the captain simply turning off the monitor because analyzing the anomaly would delay their schedule.
That's a brutal way to put it, but yes, absolutely.
Which precipitates the final impact, conflict.
Conflict represents the catastrophic failure of empathetic communication. The physician finally speaks, executing the empathetic reflection.
Okay, what do they say?
However, because the reflection is built upon a distorted, foreclosed perception of reality, it lands as profoundly alienating. The physician says, in a perfectly modulated, soothing tone, "I understand you are feeling a bit anxious, but this is a very standard procedure."
Ouch.
Right. The formatting of the empathy is technically correct. I understand you are feeling X, but because it aggressively contradicts the patient's lived experience of absolute terror, the patient feels entirely invalidated and erased.
The expressed empathy violently collides with reality.
Exactly. That collision is the conflict.
This precise mechanical sequence, reality distortion, cognitive foreclosure, and communicative conflict, it perfectly diagnoses the hollow, alienating encounters that initiated our deep dive today.
It really does.
The individual attempting to comfort you had already rigidly decided what your emotional state was, systematically ignored every subtle cue that their assumption was incorrect, and then delivered a perfectly polished, completely useless reflection that made you feel invisible.
Exactly. And analyzing this crash sequence leads to the most provocative philosophical and practical reframing in Takasugi's entire body of work, his redefinition of performative empathy.
Right, because when we experience that hollow interaction, our immediate instinct is to judge the other person's character.
Yeah.
We assume they're being intentionally fake, manipulative, or that they simply don't care about us at all.
And that assumption is precisely what Takasugi challenges. He argues that in the vast majority of cases, performative empathy is not a malicious moral failing.
It's not.
No, it is an ontological corruption born of biological necessity. The practitioner is not a sociopath trying to manipulate you. They are a human being whose layer 0 autonomic nervous system is trapped in a threat response.
They're fight or flight.
Yes. They are experiencing a profound internal demand. They must successfully execute this interaction to preserve their job, their social standing, or their own psychological safety. Because their biology has shut down the neural networks required for genuine connection, they are forced to deploy the only tools available to them, the behavioral scripts they learned in an EQ seminar.
Wow. They are trapped in the cramming state, desperately reciting the bolded textbook terms, trying to convince you they deeply understand the narrative of the novel.
Exactly.
They're faking the connection because their biology has literally locked them out of the capacity to experience it.
Precisely. And understanding performative empathy as a structural biological failure rather than a moral defect. It necessitates a complete paradigm shift in how we approach organizational and interpersonal development.
Because you can't punish someone for a biological reflex.
Right. If an individual is exhibiting performative empathy because their nervous system is flooded with cortisol, providing them with more sophisticated behavioral scripts is worse than useless. You are simply training them to become more highly polished performers. You are reinforcing the ontological corruption.
Which perfectly sets the stage for how TRI moves from diagnosis to intervention. If standard behavioral training is fundamentally flawed, how do we actually build this capacity in the real world? How does this apply to the project manager in Silicon Valley, the physician in the ER, or the parent trying to connect with a teenager?
Takasugi proposes a highly specific 3-level modular training architecture to solve this.
Okay, break down the 3 levels for us.
The 3-level modular architecture is the operational culmination of the EmpI framework, and it enforces a strict developmental hierarchy. Level 1 is entirely focused on autonomic preparation.
Autonomic preparation,
Yep.
so layer 0.
Exactly. Before a practitioner is taught a single concept regarding communication or active listening, they are trained extensively in protocols like the DAP. They must demonstrate the ability to consciously monitor their layer 0 biological state, recognize sympathetic arousal, and manually downregulate their nervous system back into ventral vagal dominance.
You cannot proceed until the biological hardware is functional.
Non-negotiable.
Okay, what does level 2 entail?
Level 2 is ontological orientation. Once the practitioner can regulate their biology, they must develop intense meta-awareness of their psychological state.
The want versus must thinking.
Right. They are trained to identify the subtle cognitive markers indicating they have slipped from the open curiosity of want thinking into the rigid demands of must thinking. They practice tolerating the anxiety of uncertainty, consciously dismantling their internal demands, and re-anchoring themselves in a preference-based reality.
So biology first, psychology second, and finally level 3.
Only at level 3, competency development, are the actual behavioral skills introduced. This is where practitioners engage in rigorous drills to refine empathetic sensitivity through deep listening exercises and practice empathetic communication through reflection formatting.
The actual words they say.
Yes. This is also where they run cross-cultural simulations to build the structural integrity required for cognitive elasticity. The critical takeaway here is that the behavioral skills are taught last, not first.
You know, the structural logic of this progression makes complete sense when you examine how we teach complex physical skills. Like if you're teaching someone to operate a heavy, complex piece of machinery, you don't start by throwing them into the operator's seat and commanding them to execute a highly intricate maneuver under pressure.
If you do that, the machine will crash.
Exactly. The foundation must be secured before the operation can commence. Level 1, the autonomic preparation, is essentially ensuring the machine's engine is actually running within safe temperature parameters and that the power grid is stable.
The hardware must be capable of bearing the load.
Right. Then level 2, the ontological orientation, is calibrating the navigation systems and ensuring the operator actually understands the terrain and the specific mission parameters.
Yes.
Only after the hardware is stable and the navigation is calibrated do you initiate level 3 and actually practice the operational maneuvers. Traditional empathy training entirely skips the engine diagnostics and the navigation, demanding complex maneuvers from a biologically overheated system.
That synthesis is brilliant, and it highlights why Takasugi's framework is gaining such immense traction globally right now. Empathetic intelligence provides organizations and individuals with a highly specific, mechanistic, diagnostic vocabulary that we have desperately lacked.
We finally have the words for it.
Yes. When a critical negotiation fails, or a team loses trust in leadership, We are no longer constrained to vague, unhelpful critiques like, oh, the leadership team just lacked emotional awareness.
Because what do you even do with that feedback?
Exactly. We can finally diagnose the specific point of failure in the system. A postmortem analysis can now be incredibly precise. You can say, the director entered the negotiation in a state of sympathetic autonomic arousal due to extreme time constraints. This biological threat response locked them into rigid must-thinking regarding the contract terms. When the client expressed valid concerns, the director's cognitive system initiated perceptual foreclosure. The resulting empathetic communication was entirely disconnected from the client's reality, triggering an immediate conflict.
Wow. That level of diagnostic precision allows for highly targeted, effective intervention and growth. It fundamentally changes empathy from this mysterious art into an observable, trainable science.
It's a total game changer.
But I also want to address a crucial safeguard built into this system. When we discuss training individuals to highly optimize their ability to read emotional states and calibrate specific responses, there is an inherent risk that these skills could be weaponized.
Ah, yes. The dark side of empathy.
Right. We're essentially describing the exact toolkit utilized by highly manipulative individuals or sociopaths to exploit people. How does the EmpI framework mechanically prevent the instrumentalization of empathy?
It's a vital question. And the safeguard against manipulation is organically integrated into the foundational architecture of the framework, specifically within the ontological layer.
Explain how that works.
Well, manipulative empathy, by definition, is entirely predicated on a rigid internal demand. The manipulator must extract a specific behavioral or emotional outcome from the recipient, whether that is compliance, affection, or a financial concession.
So the manipulator's entire operation is based on must-thinking.
Exactly, because Takasugi's framework mandates that genuine EmpI can only function when the practitioner is anchored in the open, preference-based state of want-thinking. The system actively short-circuits manipulative intent.
Oh, I see.
If a practitioner attempts to use the reflection skills to maneuver a client, they are operating from must-thinking, which inevitably triggers the reality foreclosure conflict crash sequence we just talked about.
They will eventually crash the interaction because they can't stay open to reality.
Exactly. Furthermore, because EmpI utilizes a recipient-based authenticity metric, the framework constantly measures the interaction from the perspective of the target, and the target's nervous system will biologically detect the phenomenological hollowness of the manipulator's must-thinking.
Our neuroception will catch them.
Right. The framework forces transparency. It's self-correcting.
This is incredible. We have journeyed through an incredibly dense, transformative landscape today. I mean, we began by dismantling the vague notions of emotional intelligence, establishing the highly operationalized dual-competence loop of empathetic sensitivity and empathetic reflection.
Right. Then we examine the metaphysical foundation, distinguishing between the open reception of want-thinking and the rigid perception-colonizing nature of must-thinking.
And we trace this dichotomy all the way down into layer 0, understanding how our autonomic nervous system and our neuroception dictate our biological capacity for connection long before our conscious minds even engage.
We explored the absolute necessity of cognitive elasticity in navigating complex cross-cultural environments. And we utilized the RFC framework to diagnose exactly how our empathy catastrophically crashes into reality distortion, foreclosure, and conflict.
So for everyone listening right now, navigating this complex, hyper-connected reality, your immediate actionable takeaway is this. Before you attempt to navigate a sensitive conversation, stop obsessing over the precise words you plan to say.
Put down the script.
Yes. Conduct a diagnostic check on your own biology first.
Assess your baseline.
Notice your respiration and your heart rate. Ask yourself a fundamental question. Am I entering this interaction anchored in want thinking, possessing a genuine biological curiosity about this person's reality? Or am I trapped in must thinking, driven by an anxious, sympathetic demand to fix their problem, manage their reaction, or simply project the image of a highly competent professional?
And if you identify that underlying must, you have to halt the process. Utilize whatever tools you have, breathing, walking away for a minute to downregulate your nervous system. Do not attempt to execute the software of empathy while the biological hardware is compromised.
Such a powerful reframe. And as we conclude, I know you brought a deeply provocative structural question for the audience to mull over.
I did, because Takasugi's clinical data irrefutably demonstrates that our deepest, most authentic capacity for empathy requires a biological state of ventral vagal safety and the psychological openness of want thinking.
Right.
If we accept this physiological reality, we must critically examine the environments in which we demand this empathy to occur.
The literal design of our spaces.
Yes. I want you to examine the architecture of your modern corporate workspace. Examine the relentless, unyielding cadence of digital notifications, the inherent threat matrix of continuous performance reviews, and the structural design of back-to-back, hyper-compressed scheduling.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
Right. If our environments are systematically designed to induce chronic sympathetic arousal, to keep us constantly hovering in a state of low-grade biological threat, are we fundamentally engineering spaces that render genuine human connection physiologically impossible?
Wow. If the architecture of our daily lives demands that we operate in a constant state of survival, we are literally locking the biological doors to connection from the inside.
It's a chilling thought.
It really is. It's a profound realization to carry into your next high-stakes interaction or the next time you design a meeting schedule for your team. Thank you for joining us on this extensive deep dive into Takasugi's Empathetic Intelligence framework. Remember to monitor your biology, cultivate your shape memory elasticity, and as always, stay curious.